Here we'll see an example of a missed opportunity for a strong positional sacrifice, which indeed was the best solution to the position. And it wasn't obvious, the compensation. It's actually a little bit hard to explain, but we can learn a lot from this example. This was my game as white against Sued Italic from Silver Lake 2015. It's black to play, and to my surprise, well, the opening was a Fort Knox variation of the French, and to my surprise, Italic now played the move e5, which seemed, first of all, tactically suspect and also positionally suspect in certain ways. One of the ideas of this opening is black gives up the light-squared bishop, which white now has unopposed, but maintains a lot of pawns on the light squares, and keeps a flexible position, which is very difficult to breach, and which in the long term, if white overpresses, can turn against white. But this requires that black keep a solid structure. e5, however, is not solid. In fact, it opens up a line to the black king, weakens f7, for instance. The other thing is that it just looks tactically suspect, first of all, because the pawn is not well guarded on e5, white can capture. Of course, quickly I realized that if white captures, black was intending to play bishop d6, since the pawn is pinned, and now he is able to attack the pawn 2 more times and keep it pinned against the rook on e1. So he regains the pawn, and after some long thought, actually, as I remember, this was a few years ago, but long thought, I realized that this actually wasn't working so well for white. In fact, if I just move my queen away somewhere, for instance, let's say if I go queen to h3, then black can play knight takes e5, and here he threatens the bishop as well as knight to f3, attacking the rook on e1. So white would have to play some clumsy moves like bishop e2, and in fact black's initiative continued to build. Actually here I think there's a number of ways that black can continue here. The bishop is still pinned on e2, so for instance there's knight e to g4, also just bringing the queen out, queen c7, building up with rook a to d8, and it wasn't looking so great for white. In fact, black's active pieces compensated at least for the 2 bishops. Other ways of trying to arrange this also didn't work out so well. So for instance, if bishop c2, knight takes c5, queen to d1, this is also fairly passive, and once again black is able to start building up threats. I think probably here something like queen to c7, rook a to d8 is coming. There are threats to h2, eventually to f2, and white's pieces are very passive. You can't say that the 2 bishops are really achieving anything for white here. So this wasn't what I wanted. So ultimately I ended up, after very long thought, playing queen h3 and allowing black to isolate the d-pawn, thinking that here I would get attacking chances by bringing the knight up, let's say to f5, and the pawn on d4 keeps the black knight out. So white's position remains fairly active, but now this pawn is weaker and black has a d5 square. And in fact, after a strong move queen a5, strong maneuver, attacking the rook on e1, and after bishop before queen h5, driving the white queen away, because the exchange of queens is in black's favor. Queen g3, knight e5, black actually had a great game, and white's positions soon started to go downhill. Bishop f6 was coming. Black has activity and pressure on d4, and there are no real threats to black's position. Again, the 2 bishops are not very tangible here. Now let's go back and instead see what I should have done after e5. Of course, my intuition here was actually turned out to be correct, that this move was suspicious, but it's not at all obvious to show how. First of all, I would have to take on e5, bishop d6, and here, of course, I considered the move e6. This was key part of my calculations, but the problem is that, well, the idea is, of course, that I give back the pawn, but if he plays simply f takes e6 or rook takes e6 followed by f takes e6 after the trade of rooks, his position is just bad for black. He has weaknesses now, and he doesn't have this open e-file that gave him activity. So, for instance, bishop c2, and now black's position is just full of weakness. The e-pawn, of course, can be attacked later. Bishop b3. Black doesn't have the tactical threats or the activity that he needed to justify his position. Knight e5, for instance, doesn't achieve anything after something like queen to h3, and unlike before, the rook on e1, of course, is perfectly fine. There's no need to worry about discoveries because the e-file is closed. Black's position is just bad. Bishop g5 is coming, rook a to d1, and so on. So this wasn't something that I was, of course, I would be very happy after to be able to play e6, but I saw the reply knight e5, and then after e takes f7 check, king takes f7, and the problem was that white's losing material now. Or if white doesn't take, it's the same thing. Black will take the bishop on d3, followed by bishop takes h2. So if the queen moves and protects the bishop wherever it might go, black can take. Queen takes, bishop takes h2, followed by taking the queen. Also capturing an f7, this also doesn't make a difference. In fact, here also, now the e-file is open, so black can also recapture with the knight, and again, queen takes d3, bishop takes h2, and black wins. So, however, as it turned out, the correct solution to the problem was, in this position, as I said, to play e6 and knight e5, and now either immediately rook takes e5 or e takes f7 first. They lead to the same position. I guess rook takes e5 would cut down black's options slightly because there's no possibility of the knight recapturing on f7 and avoiding that position, although that would be bad for black as well. So takes, bishop takes, e takes f7, king takes f7. White has sacrificed the exchange for only one pawn. Now important is the move bishop c4. This had to be foreseen as well. King f8. And this position, while there's no clear forcing line, is a clear advantage for white, despite the material disadvantage and the fact that there's no immediate threats. Black simply can't free himself. Black is caught in a positional grip of the two bishops and his king being cut on f8. Of course, if the king was on h8, it would be a different story. But there's no way to escape for the king, and white has terrible pressure on the light squares, which is making it impossible for black to play. Now, there's many possibilities for black here, and for white as well. In fact, numerous moves keep white having the advantage. For instance, here it's possible to play even g4. And we'll see that later. This is actually a pretty good idea because it forces h6, which further weakens black's position, allowing queen to come to f5 more easily, for instance. g4 can be just protected by h3, and white continues to build up. That's one possibility. But also simple, more likely what I would play would be bishop e3, threatening to check on c5, developing a piece. Queen e7, for instance, stepping the queen off of the d-file and covering c5. And now rook e1. And here, still, there are no really concrete threats yet, but black can't free himself. So here, maybe bishop d4 is coming, not exactly quite yet, but his sample line would be queen c7, logical move, also stepping the queen off of the e-file. But this leads us to bishop c5 check, bishop d6, and then queen f4, with a cross pin on the bishop on d6. So if bishop takes c5, white throws in rook takes e8 check, the knight can't recapture, and the queen is captured then on the next move on c7. Meanwhile, if black protects, then rook d1, and black just can't protect the bishop anymore and loses. Now, this isn't forced, black can avoid this, but it shows example. b6 would be a way to avoid it. And I guess queen takes c6 is probably not the best because black will gain some counterplay. It would allow black to maybe get rook c8 followed by eventually knight g4. But in any case, we don't need to. We can just play quiet move bishop b3. And still black can't free himself. For instance, rook a to c8, g4 once again, threatening g5, h6, h3. Just quiet play. White slowly improves his position despite being down the exchange. It's a rather unusual position, but black can't ever move his g-pawn, so that was an important feature, of course. All the previous moves, there was no g6 followed by king g7 because white would have bishop h6. So let's say queen to d7. What else can black do? Queen f5 is coming, and then queen to g6 would even more, after queen to d7, for instance, would even more restrict black and tie black down. The knight eventually will make its appearance, knight to d2, to c4, to e4 perhaps, or knight to g3, which may either force the exchange of black's bishop, which could be fatal with the dark squares then, or if the black's bishop is pinned, then also the knight can come up that way. It's just really hard to find moves for black here, and white's making steady progress. If queen to d7, many moves just lose by force, such as this, which allows white to strike, and with the combination bishop takes h6, g takes h6, rook takes e5, followed by queen takes f6, and white wins. And if black doesn't take the rook, well, his position is also, again here, after king g7, for instance, black is still up the exchange, nominally, but his position is terrible. He has exposed king and fatally weak on the light squares. So, for instance, rook f5 is one way to continue, and then the knight comes up, which would be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, I can't go into every line from this position that results after the exchange sacrifice, let's say, for instance, here. But suffice to say, white has more than enough compensation and is basically an impossible position for black to play. So the factor that made white's compensation is the disorganization of black's pieces, especially due to this bishop. And this is affected by the fact that black has a severe weakness of the light squares. He's missing the light square bishop and the important f7 pawn. And the exposed black king, and general the fact that there are no points in white's position to attack. So white can build up at leisure, and black has no useful open lines because the files cannot be used by the black rooks. Most sacrifices have some sort of structural component, even when ultimately their justification lies in some form of attack. Often we're trying to shut down squares for our opponent, open squares for ourselves, open lines, open diagonals, and to this end, pawns can often be sacrificed. We'll see here an example which is actually pretty typical for certain variations of the Sicilian. This comes from my game from 2009, Washington, D.C., against a player named Rodriguez, master level player, 2284 FIDE. Here, well, it's a typical position that came from the Richter Rouser. An important element is the black's pawn on h4, which on one hand cripples white's kingside pawn structure, making it impossible for me to just continue the attack in the typical Sicilian fashion with g4, but at the same time it also creates weaknesses in black's position as well. His king may not be so safe on the king side, and for this reason black has left his king in the center. But it's hard to get to that king, and in order to do something I planned this pawn sacrifice. Here I played a strange-looking move, rook c1, but it has a very concrete purpose. This move intends to play c4, which is quite a serious threat. This would break down the queen side and allow white to create quick threats against the queen side and the middle. And of course, white's king would not be in any danger either, with black's rook on h8 out of the game. So black would face problems on the c-file, the sacrifice bishop takes e6 if black takes. Also, if black arranges to push b4 in response to c4, then white could prepare to play c5 later. So here my opponent played d5, which was pretty much forced, at least I considered at the time. This is a typical Sicilian break. White has a good answer to it. And this is where the pawn sacrifice comes in. Simply capturing on d5 would give black the open lines he wants. Knight takes d5, this knight would come into good square. Black would have a very good structure. Bishop on e3 is also threatened with exchange. Bishop will probably come to f6 or maybe bishop b4, these kinds of things. And black can still castle later at a moment's notice. Instead, I played e5. keeping the lines closed for black and opening key lines and squares for white. Another element of this is the fact that the black queen is driven to a very poor position. So here my opponent accepted the sacrifice by queen takes e5. If instead knight to d7, then white continues with f4. And the position takes on a French character. However, black's position is rather passive. He hasn't advanced any kind of play on the queen side. He's not creating real threats there. And here f5 is the threat, breaking down the pawn chain and opening up the position where the black king would come under a decisive attack. g6, black could play to prevent f5, and now he has a nice pawn structure on the king side. And it's possible for white to play slowly in some ways here. But also, the sacrifice bishop takes g6 could be seriously considered, and black's position is in danger. For instance, if it takes, knight takes, queen c6, there's f5. The position opens up and the black pieces are poorly placed. White's down one piece for 2 pawns, that is. But the threat is knight g7 and f6, with the pawns advancing irresistibly. And if black takes, then knight g7. Again, knight takes f5, and this, despite black's extra piece, the position is very difficult to defend because there's no coordination for black. His bishop on e7 is awkward, and if knight takes, then this knight will come into a pin. I think bishop d4, and white quickly regains some material with a crushing attack. So this is one possibility, but my opponent decided instead to take the pawn. Queen takes e5. Now the point was bishop f4, driving the queen first of all to a bad square and taking better control over e5. Of course, black couldn't take on d4 because of the standard tactic, bishop takes b5 check. So he played queen h5, and now rook c to e1. So really the sacrifice was a real sacrifice. There are a lot of cases where black actually can't take the pawn on e5 because the queen could be trapped there, but here it had the escape on h5. Nevertheless, despite black's extra center pawn, his pawns are blockaded and his pieces are poorly placed in the long run here. And actually in medium run, short to medium run as well, because white has some immediate threats of knight f5, knight takes c6, this kind of thing. Rook e5 actually also, of course, is the main threat, trapping the queen and forcing black to play g5, which also doesn't save the queen anyway. So actually, he played now knight to d7, stopping. Black's able to defend against the threat, but the main point is that black queen is poorly placed. One thing, white has opened the e-file and opened the e5 square without freeing black's pieces, the bishop or the knight, which was the case of e takes d5. And so here, white has more than enough compensation, and black's in big trouble. But there were some errors. This was the last round, and position is complicated. And I intended knight f5, which doesn't win back any material, but further increases white's advantage. And it was very clear that this led to a better position after e takes f5, which is forced. Otherwise, white threatens knight takes g7, as well as taking the bishop, followed by queen to b4, and such moves. So e takes f5, bishop d6, winning back the piece. Black has to castle. Then rook takes e7, threatening the knight. Knight bishop c6, queen f4. This is what I calculated, and white has a decisive advantage here. Black's pieces are jumbled up. The queen is poorly placed, can't get back into the game. f5 pawn is hanging after g6, for instance. I think here bishop to b4, and black still has no moves with queen to d6 coming. Bishop c3 and queen to d4, and just black's pieces don't coordinate. But I decided instead, I thought I could win by force. As is often the case, you have one very strong possibility, and you have to compare it to the possibility of even immediately ending the game. And I made some miscalculation. I played knight takes e6. The sacrifice was not the best. It's not bad for white, but it's not the best. He took, rook takes. So here the idea was that white threatens bishop g6. winning the queen as well as rook e1, and the bishop can be further piled up by queen e2 or queen e3. But actually black is able to survive. Here he, however, made a mistake, rook c6, which was not the best. After I moved, I realized I had overlooked something, that he could play king f7, which both unpins the bishop and covers g6 at least enough. And here I would have to win the queen for two pieces with bishop g6, rook takes, queen takes g6, rook takes g6, king takes g6. And black ends up with a rook and two minor pieces for a queen. However, of course, his king is not safe, his pieces still don't coordinate very well, and he has some weaknesses, so position is still pretty unclear. Probably worse for white, but it's hard for black to coordinate the pieces, and so there's practical chances at the minimum. But this was how black could have played, and probably you could say has an advantage. However, my opponent played rook c6, and having realized my mistake, my intention had been rook h to e1, allowing the exchange of rooks with the same issue, bishop g6, as coming, as well as further attack on the bishop if black defends against this. But of course now I realized he could play king f7, which is even worse, because a pair of rooks has also been exchanged, lessening my chances of attack after winning the queen. Therefore, after rook c6, I played instead rook takes c6, bishop takes c6, and here, this is still, while we've strayed a little bit because I made a mistake, it's still relevant to the subject matter, because here I'm down a piece, and I played queen to c3, regaining some material. But actually, here we see that even after the quiet move, rook e1, white retains a winning position, again because of the positional factors, which actually compensate for being a whole piece down in this case. Black's pieces don't coordinate, his queen is caught on the side of the board, his pieces don't work well together. This threatens bishop d6, and the main point is after king f7, queen e3 wins back the piece with a decisive attack due to the dual threats of queen e6 and also queen takes e7. Black can't save the piece. Meanwhile, if king f8, rook e6 attacks the bishop and threatens bishop g6. So strangely enough, well, you can't really call this a positional justification only, because actually white is, there's some tactics underlying it, but after the simple quiet move rook e1, black is unable to defend. The game actually went queen c3, threatening the bishop, and black played rook h6, which was a move I had overlooked. He defends his bishop and also activates the rook. I had been planning knight c5, but then rook e1 would have threatened to take black's knight, as well as queen takes g7 and so on, and bishop d6, and white has a winning attack, which is also, if the bishop moves to b7, for instance, there's queen c7, these kind of things. But rook h6, now I had to take the rook, because otherwise black will succeed in defending. After rook e1, for instance, black can play something like rook f6. But anyway, so I took the rook. There didn't seem to be any better moves. Queen takes h6, rook e1. And this was the result. Black has two pieces for a rook and a pawn. Position is unclear, but I think it's a little bit difficult for black to play, and my opponent was also in time pressure, so he ended up losing. Not really part of our subject matter. He played king f7, which was a first mistake. These positions can be hard to play, especially in time pressure. He should have played something like king f8, so this way he avoids the potential check on e6. After queen a5, then white starts creating some threats against the queen side, and while black's position is certainly not easy to play. The queen starts to invade, maybe to c7 as well. But that was better than what he played. After king f7, bishop f5. Now black has to worry about bishop e6 winning the queen, but of course now white also will take pawn on g7, and black king will be in in trouble. So here he made a further mistake, knight c5, giving back material and hoping to escape, but this was a nervous decision in time pressure, and he should have held the line with knight f8. Still, position is not very clear. Black has no targets for white, but he can hope to hold his pieces in a reasonable coordination, keep his king reasonably safe, so it's a tough position for both sides to play. But after knight c5, took on e7, king takes e7, queen takes c5, check, queen d6, which was my opponent's idea. Now the idea was if I trade queens, then his king would come in on the dark squares. Of course, queen takes e6, queen takes e6. Black is down a pawn, but positional compensation is more than enough, as the king will start to come in, and actually white could get in trouble. So I didn't do that. Instead, after queen d6, I keep the queens on the board. After queen a7, king f6, bishop d3. And white's up a pawn. Perhaps my opponent hoped that the dark squares would still, even with the queens on the board, be the relevant factor, but it's actually turns out it's not correct, because he also has some a problems because his a pawn is hanging, and also queen to d4 is a threat. In fact, the game only lasted one more move. After queen e5, I played a3, and black just resigned here because he's losing more pawns. He's losing the a pawn and eventually the b pawn as well. And there's no counterplay whatsoever either, because all of white's points are linked up. He can't go after the g pawn because his own bishop will also be pinned on the 6th rank. So black's resignation was justified. Sacrifices can often be made with the purpose of opening up a bishop's diagonal, especially exchange sacrifices, and you see this frequently in openings with fianchettoed bishops, such as the King's Indian, the Dragon, and the Pierre's Defense. In this case, from the position you see on the board, black actually has misplayed the opening and stands quite badly. Nevertheless, I believe the sacrifice that I now made was the best chance. This will be an excerpt from my game against Grandmaster Dmitry Gordievsky from Philadelphia 2019. It's black to play, and while the white king is in the center and white hasn't finished development, nevertheless black already has serious problems. First of all, white has control over e4, blockade point on e4, which is making it difficult to activate the black forces. In particular, the bishop on g7 is stymied. Black's knights can't get into it, and white has an excellent base of operations on e4. Black is also in some trouble on the king's side. White has created tension, will take on g6 at some moment, followed by knight to f6 can be a potential plan, opening the g-file after white has already castled and made some further preparations. Another point is that white can play h6, forcing the black bishop to h8, after which black will have permanent problems with the king and a permanently entombed bishop. So this is also a problem for black. And simply black has no plan. White is going to play queen c2, castle the king safely, and it will be very difficult to create any threats against the white king on the queen side. Black can't realistically open lines there, and his pieces can't get at the white king. So it turns out to be fairly irrelevant that these two pawns are held back by this pawn. And in fact, white does have a large advantage here. But the King's Indian is a tricky opening, and black relies on some tactical chances here, and in this case it's not really sufficient, but it creates great problems for white. This is what I played, rook f4, and I'm sure my opponent saw this move coming. It's not actually something to be enormously concerned about, but it nevertheless creates some annoyance for white and forces him to solve some problems. So first of all, I didn't consider, and I don't think my opponent either considered simply taking the rook. After e takes f4, the position has changed enormously in black's benefit. Despite the lack of the exchange, suddenly the bishop is open, firing along a very strong diagonal against a point that is fixed on b2. Black has also gained the e5 square for the knight. And he's gained control over the dark squares, so it becomes difficult for white to play a realistic game, a normal game, when black has such a high level of control over one color of squares. Next will be coming, for instance, knight e5, bishop f5. Perhaps white's best chance would be at some point to play knight f6 and give back the exchange after, let's say, the knight has gone to e5. Nevertheless, black will have a great position. Even after that, with bishop f5 coming, checks on d3. There's also weaknesses of d3 and f3 squares when the knight comes to e5. So this is, while no variations concrete I'm not going to give concrete variations at this moment because it's rather pointless. White could play many different moves, but generally speaking, black has great compensation, and I don't think many players would take this exchange. Fortunately for white, he doesn't have to. And I was concerned here about the reply queen to c2, just continuing with the plan of castling queenside. Perhaps in the future, black's hanging rook could be a problem for him. Maybe some point white will be able to take, perhaps followed up by knight f6 or after knight f6, opening lines. But also white prepares to just castle, and eventually bishop will come to h3 also, with the bishop aiming along this diagonal, ready to make a profitable exchange for black's light squared bishop. Also, at the right moment, white could take, and then knight f6, opening the g-file. So after queen c2, I was urgently searching for some way to create problems for my opponent. When the long-range or long-term factors are in your opponent's favor, you have to try to create some immediate troubles for them. Use the dynamic resources of your position. And while black's position is objectively bad, there are some resources because the white king is in the center, and black has some targets, e4, and so on. So here I was looking at the move knight b3, which I believe is why my opponent avoided queen c2, most likely. Still, it was seemed to be not. It seemed to be insufficient according to what I saw, although I was hoping that it would work, and it does look a little bit scary for white. He has to take the knight because otherwise the knight gets to d4 and creates great problems for white, perhaps forcing white to take the knight, in which case black again lengthens the dark squared bishop's diagonal, and the knight can come to e5 afterwards, and white's dark squared bishop is missing. So white would have to take the knight, and now a takes b3, and the knight on e4 is hanging, so white has to keep it guarded while saving the queen to d3. Now, I was looking at such moves like a b5, based on the fact that really white's position, black's position rather, it will collapse on its own if left without something drastic happening. White can just castle, eventually protect the knight. The pawn on b3 might drop off, and that's just in addition to the problems black already had from before. So I did look at b5, trying to again open lines. White would probably have to take. And then rook a4 was idea. Still trying to get white to take the knight, take the rook on f4 by attacking the knight on e4. However, it looks like after capturing followed by castles, black may have just shed too much material to justify his play. Well, it's at least hard for black to justify. I guess there's moves like knight e5, and white still has to keep the knight on e4 guarded. But I think white can go knight f6, and then take the pawn on b3, at least according to this moment. The rook of looking at the moment, so the rook is hanging, and the bishop can be captured back next move, in which case black's position would collapse. It was also possible instead of b5 to just play rook h4. When black saves the rook and keeps it in an active position, the open a file exists. The pawn on b3 might drop off, but white still has some problems to deal with in consolidating, but I'm sure that black's position is not also here adequate. However, my opponent didn't make the decision to play queen c2 and face these problems. He wanted to have everything, and instead he played f3, which really makes knight b3 pretty pointless, and also prepares to take, or rather to play h6, followed by taking the rook, or actually h6 followed by bishop h3 is also an idea, because the bishop would have to retreat to h8, or if it goes to f8, white could probably take the rook. So h6 is a bit of a threat. By the way, at this point, well, it's actually the previous move, yeah. Just to show how white had captured here at the point where we entered the position, he could have played h6 and then captured, in which case here I wouldn't probably play rook to f4, but with the kingside close, I would have to try to create a blockade with the knight c5. Here, with white having released the tension on the kingside, at least he doesn't have the possibility of creating a direct attack, so I have a chance to create essentially a fortress, although this is a very grim position for black as well. Anyway, going back to where we were, he did play f3, but this gives black chance to activate his play. First I played the paradoxical g takes h5, actually grabbing some material. But the purpose of this is, first of all, to make sure he can't play h6 himself. So this is important. And now I also want to get my bishop to f5 and have the g6 square later. And in fact, this pawn in the future could be a problem for white, even if it is a doubled pawn, essentially not even something you can consider extra material. It's still a pawn that could be a feature of the position that could become a factor later if white doesn't capture it. So here my opponent decided now to capture the exchange, now that I've taken on h5, and he can eventually check on f6 and force open the g-file. And on the surface it looked like it looked just bad for black. He takes, and then he's going to castle, queen c2 and castle, and it appeared that as soon as the knight moves from d7 to e5, for instance, white's going to give a check on f6, remove the Darksford bishop, and the black king will come in the firing line. This turned out to be false. Nevertheless, after g takes h5, it's actually no longer so simple for white, because after queen c2, I can now remove my rook from danger, put it on h4, where it's actually looks strange, but it doesn't, there's no way to actually trap the rook. In fact, black's position, well, now has an extra pawn, and if I can achieve knight f8, bishop f5, and knight g6, black will stand quite well. Bishop f5, that is, black will stand quite well, and white will have no reason to claim to have an advantage. Black will have covered the kingside, activated his pieces, even have an extra pawn. And in some cases, the rook could go back to f4 as well. So he took on f4, I took back queen c2. This is white's plan, to castle queenside. Here I played king h8, not yet showing my intention. This is a move that has to be played. King steps off the g-file. My opponent castled. If he didn't, really, I could play the same follow-up, and even with the white king in the center, it would be dangerous, but also the white king in the center is in danger for other reasons. So really, he had to continue his plan to castle. And here, I don't think my opponent saw the next move, which is actually unusual looking, but actually fairly thematic. But I considered that I really liked my next move and was quite proud of it, because this idea was hidden and not so obvious at first. And in fact, I didn't spot it right away on the previous move, but I was instead looking to try to make moves like knight e5 followed by bishop f5 work. Of course, if black could achieve that, it would be good, but white takes on c5 and it doesn't work out well for black. Also, knight takes e4 also was not successful after knight takes e4. I think actually, different possibilities, but it didn't seem to be sufficient, and this is what my opponent counted on, that when my knight leaves d7, he's going to play knight f6, force me to take it. I'll have two pawns for the exchange, but there will be doubled h-pawns. My king will be wide open, and without the Darksford bishop, there will be no threats to the white king. However, here came the shocker. Rook a6. Down the exchange, black simply brings the rook slowly into the game. but the threats to b2 arise very quickly, and that pawn is fixed. It can't be advanced, of course. If it pushes forward 2 squares, black will capture en passant, and the pawn on a3 will fall as well. So here white was in big trouble. He played rook e1, which was the strongest move, and he intends now to create some counter threats, because when knight f6 comes, which he'll have to play, there will be possibilities of the rook coming in. Also now his king is able to move over. I played rook to b6, threatening b2. If I capture that, I can create a decisive attack. Also, if he gives up his queen, it will be insufficient in most cases. So also knight c3 would allow me to now play knight e5, and black has pure initiative here with no compensation for white. The bishop will soon reach f5 with tempo. Black will play, for instance, queen f8, bishop f5, and knight will be invading on d3. b2 pawn is still under permanent attack. So this is not something white can consider. Also note that knight takes a4 would once again remove the defense of the b2 pawn, allowing, for instance, capture, followed by rook takes b2, for instance, here, in a discovery. Knight takes f3, knight takes e1. So, yeah. So my opponent played knight f6. We won't cover so much more, but because it goes off of our subject in a moment. I took, of course, keeping my dark squared bishop takes, keeping e8 guarded. I would like to take with my queen, but rook e8 then would follow. b2 is once again under attack. He played knight e4, and here I, with time low, the game had been complicated earlier, and both players had been looking deeply at possibilities. I was also looking earlier for some way because my position was quite bad. Here I missed the most obvious move. I looked at rook takes b2, but this is meant by knight takes f6, rook takes c2, king takes c2, and black loses back the material after bishop f5, king d1. There's no stopping rook e8, winning back the queen and leaving white up material. So for instance, bishop g6, rook takes g6, followed by rook e8, and white's up a piece in the end. Although black's position is actually playable somewhat, but worse. Bishop f5 didn't work. Also tempting move, because here white has the spectacular knight takes d6, threatening checkmate on f7. And I held out some hope, also attacking the bishop, I held out some hope of knight to b3, so that the queen could be captured with check. The queen has to capture, of course, and again mate is threatened. C takes d6, leaving the white queen under attack and protecting the rook on b6 by the queen, preparing to take b2, after which this is exactly what black wants, having two bishops aimed at the white king and breaking through to b2. However, white has the tactical blow, queen takes b6, which refutes black's play, so that didn't work, because rook e8 if the queen was captured. There were some other moves. Knight takes c4 followed by bishop takes b2 would leave white with the initiative. Here, black would have achieved his goal of taking b2, but he doesn't get the bishop to this diagonal. And this is key because white is now about to play bishop d3, threatening mate on h7. Also threatens rook e8, queen e8, so bishop e5 is forced, bishop d3, and then white can follow up after, for instance, queen e7, queen takes f4, or even rook g5, and black's position collapses. It's down the exchange and doesn't have the threats against the white king. Rook takes h5 is coming, also perhaps rook takes e5 at the minimum. In some cases it can be played, removing that important bishop. But this also doesn't work for black. So looking at these things, somehow I missed the most obvious bishop takes b2, which, well, it's the most obvious move, but somehow giving up the bishop was not intuitively the move I wanted to play. After king d1, then bishop f5 is possible because taking the queen is check, and black achieves everything he wants. Black has a winning position. Bishop moves, followed by rook to b2, that kind of thing. 3 pawns for the exchange, by the way. Meanwhile, if queen takes, which is of course why I didn't play bishop takes b2, although I didn't really calculate here, rook takes b2, knight f6 no longer works because black has knight b3, followed by taking the knight with check in a winning position for black. king takes b2, meanwhile, is met by knight takes e4, followed by bishop f5, and black achieves everything now. Queen f6 comes. Black has queen against 2 rooks, but black also has 3 pawns as well. Material advantage, and bishop g6 secures the black king, and white king is permanently open. So this is just winning by force. Bishop takes b2. Instead, I played queen e7, and after some severe complications, it ended up winning the game anyway. But this was not part of, won't be part of our subject, because it just goes into tactical complications. So the point was this rook f4 move, very typical in King's Indian and other fianchettoed bishop structures, tempting white to open the long diagonal. It's well known that in King's Indian, also Benoni, there are many positions where the dark squared bishop unopposed is worth more than the exchange. In fact, it's perhaps the norm rather than the exception.